Hello, my name is Alice, and today I am joined by my co-host Alex.
Hey guys, and we want to welcome you to today's podcast episode of A&A's.
It ain't over.
And today we'll be discussing how contemporary American narratives imagine the legacy of slavery in ways that explore our racial tensions today and how these mediums imagine avenues for liberation and freedom that cannot be easily or fully obtained.
And our focus will be on the novel Copper Sun by Sharon M. Draper, the 2020 film Antebellum, and an image that has been surfing the web for quite a while now that we'll call the Lewis Hamilton image for reference. We will also be extracting several points made by Deva Pager, Hannah Shepard, and Heather O'Connell.
And I believe you introduced me to our three main contemporary narratives based on what you've heard about Sharon Draper's novels, Janelle Monáe also appearing in Antebellum, and what you've seen previously by Lewis Hamilton on an Instagram page, since I'm not as socially savvy.
Yeah, so a while back, I read one of Draper's other novels and thought she was an amazing author. The Lewis Hamilton picture was the second one since I remembered it long ago because of his excellent comparison of the abuses endured by Black people from slavery and modern times. The film I wasn't a fan of, but the shocking twist presented a great parallel to slavery in modern times from the novel and the picture. Don't forget about the other two mediums.
Oh yeah, so to help with our analysis, we chose two sociological studies conducted by Hadrian Shepard as well as another sociological professor, O'Connell, on the study of racial discrimination in the United States and how Black people are not easily able to obtain freedom since the antebellum era of slavery.
So, Alex, first explain to the audience about our first contemporary narrative, Copper Sun.
So, if you haven't seen or heard any of these mediums, do not fret. We've got you covered. In Copper Sun, it features the story of a 15-year-old girl named Amari who was stolen from her village home of Ziavi in Africa. Her father and eight-year-old brother are slaughtered along with most of her village as only the able-bodied young adults are spared, but forced into being shackled with chains around their necks, feet, and wrists, and joined in a coffle to be later branded, starved, and beaten.
So they're taken onto a ship where the African men are stacked like sardines at the bottom, and they're forced to defecate onto each other while rats gnaw at their bodies. The African women are tied to poles above the ship while their captors beat them, starve them, and rape them as they please when they please. This journey lasts for weeks after weeks before they arrive at Sullivan's Island in America, where the African people are warned to submit to slavery, a gruesome custom they are completely unaware of.
Then Amari gets sold to the highest bidder, a man named Mr. Derby, during a slave auction because, as he claims, quote, "I want her for my son. Today's his 16th birthday," unquote. And Mr. Derby also buys a white female indentured servant, who is named Polly, who has to pay off her own and her parents' debt for the next 14 years.
Immediately, when I read this, I thought Draper paralleled being an indentured servant to being a slave. I was like, in no way is it close. And Draper reveals agreement with me as she writes the head chef of the plantation Teeny to insinuate that Polly must stop acting like she understands what it's like to be a slave. The African woman stolen from her land has been tortured because she's deemed black and a savage without precedent. This is important to highlight as we have to acknowledge the misogyny that black women face today is incomparable to no other.
And Black women during the antebellum era definitely face more disadvantages than their white counterparts. And Polly is a prime example of someone who believes they're enduring the same experience as an enslaved person.
Sounds like Polly needs a reality check.
And she does. And she definitely gets one when Amari trips while cleaning up after her master and spills food on the floor, granting her lashes and being beaten on her back to the point where she cannot move. This was a real eye opener for Polly, and especially when Amari is healed and Clay is ordered her straight after to his bedroom, it's speechless. Polly finds herself feeling very sorry for Amari because of the abuses against all the enslaved individuals on the plantation. And so, collectively, they decide to escape to the Spanish colony of Florida with Tidbit, Teeny's younger son, in hopes of finding freedom. Along the way, the three pair deal with the pitfalls of potentially being caught and brought back to the plantation, even confronting Clay, who finds them heading south instead of north, as most African Americans did to escape from slavery. But they do outsmart him and leave him to his own demise. They do eventually make it to Florida, finding initial freedom, but Amari finds she's pregnant with Clay's son, or child. In the lost hope of everlasting freedom, Amari attempts to find freedom within the child's birth, contemplating if it's a boy or girl, carrying the souls and experiences of her lost ancestors and family and carrying on the freedom.
Did you know why Sharon Draper created the book?
I think I have an idea, but why don't we explain to the audience why authors such as Draper create these kinds of novels?
So from what I remember, Draper visited Africa and saw the historical remains of the slave trade. Then she used and then she used it in her novel based on a year's worth of research to tell the story of many African women who had to endure the horrors of slavery.
So by this you mean Draper used a fictional character to explore the experiences of Black people to portray to our audience an accurate account of the millions of lives lost during the Atlantic slave trade?
Exactly. Draper is one of the many authors who created slave narratives for that purpose and why her work became so successful after its publication. And it's insane to think in her novel, Polly hadn't realized how bad slaves had it until she had to sleep and watch over one of them. Reminds me of modern times with demands usually being considered only when there's enough uproar from all parties. For example, police brutality has been occurring for a long time with law enforcement abusing their power. It's also important to note the world was in shambles after the killing of several Black community members. This gaining worldwide attention has sparked much controversy. Many people who tend to have implicit biases of Black people always have an unnecessary critique on the technicalities behind a Black person being murdered. When a white person falls victim to police brutality, there's no questioning their character, and a specific genre of people get enraged around this time around at least, demanding changes when they didn't bat an eyelash for Black lives.
And with that, there comes this integral photo. So in June 2020, a photo by @Judah Yakman on Twitter surfaced on the internet. The photo depicted two similarly posed but different Black men. Both men are hunched over, showing the full arc of their back, or their assaulted backs, one being an enslaved Black man with lashes on his back, side by side with a modern Black man, with several bullet holes bleeding from his back. For those who don't know who the first image subject is, he was an African-American man in slavery pictured in March 1863. On the white and Black photograph seen here, the man was historically known as Whip Peter for the prominent and visible scarring to his back incurred by the act of whipping. And by displaying Peter and the modern-day Black man side by side, we believe the Twitter thread intended to show that nothing has changed.
And modern film has also exhibited this theme as we witness the story of a Black woman being kidnapped from her family and forced into slavery in a Civil War reenactment part in the 2020 film Antebellum. The ending of the movie was thought-provoking as the director showed the city located in Louisiana parallel to where the park was held. They were side by side in 2020. Yes, it is a fictional movie, but thinking more in depth, I'd say this symbolizes how close we still are to those times. Wouldn't you think?
Okay, so would you say that you're more focused on the philosophical idea behind the film?
Precisely.
How so?
So I have critiques about the film on how it tried to display a concept that had no support. Even many film critics and the general public thought the movie wasn't living up to its full concept at a quick glance from Rotten Tomatoes. This is purely for the script and the cinematography of it. However, taking a few steps back and looking at the whole picture, Antebellum showcases that even in modern times, although slavery has technically been abolished, Black people find difficulty in actually feeling liberated. Well, how? So the town was literally situated next to a slavery reenactment. Why does that exist in 2020? And although it isn't real, the feeling of thinking it could be possible is. Enslavement presents itself in different forms, showing boundless captivity. Antebellum is a film that illuminates what Black people cannot escape from.
So in fact, did you know that these parks actually exist and they forego the violence?
I didn't, and I'm not surprised. I don't see the purpose.
Neither do I. You can read about this history and educate yourself. It appears on it. These actual parks and educate yourself appears on it. There being actual parks until this day blows my mind.
Black people cannot catch a break. They're constantly being subjected to systemic racism and discrimination already. And now even more so, they still have to endure witnessing their trauma being used for unprovoked entertainment purposes. Nothing has changed.
And I think many people get a rise out of their sufferings, and that's how it's always been. Then they try to justify it, like Mr. Derby and Copper's son. One line that caught my attention while reading the novel was when he said, with his full chest, "Black women are different, you know, Clay. They like it when you pick them out for special favors at night. It keeps them happy."
He's delusional. If a black woman ever said that to him, she was forced to. It makes him sleep better at night thinking he was doing black people a favor. He's literally restricting them from a life he wouldn't even be able to survive for a moment in.
And he stole Mari from her family, murdered them all, then beats and abuses her and lets her son, or his son, sexually abuse her. To this day, Black women find themselves being interrogated for making accusations against someone who harasses them. No one wants to believe them unless they check every box on this imaginary misogynistic checklist that never rules in the favor of justice for Black women. Like Dr. Veronica Henley said in the movie Antebellum, they're painted as this angry Black woman stereotype when they're only reacting to the nonsense people tried to give them.
And it really isn't fair that everyone tries to deny Black women the privilege of voicing their opinions. It shouldn't even be a privilege, it should be a human right. But because of the oppression, Black women aren't allowed to have a voice without being gaslighted. They're always a butt of a bad joke and having their feelings validated. People try to make themselves feel better for treating them as such by categorizing them as rude, loud, angry, so that anything that they say gets ignored because their character has already been made for them. And the list actually goes on and on and on. Police violence, sexual assault, lack of concern for missing Black girls, it doesn't matter what status you hold. No position of power or privilege can protect Black women from the misogyny they face and are expected by society to handle with grace. It all traces back to its roots, which is slavery.
And there's so much that can be found historically that links slavery to the suppression of Black people face to this day. For instance, Heather O'Connell, who currently works at the Louisiana State University's sociology department as an assistant professor, wrote a thesis on racial inequality and discrimination that has originated from slavery and persisted into the modern age. Her sociological study largely focuses on the counties of the southern United States and how discrimination relates to poverty rates found with both rural and urban areas. O'Connell largely focuses on the legacy of slavery and how factors such as a perceived racial threat, demographic and economic conditions after slavery, and the distribution of wealth between white and Black people have shaped the environmental landscape for Black people today. Before her study, similar scholars reviewed how the legacy of slavery institutionalized itself within current U.S. laws, as well as occupational mobility projections and how relationships of poverty and discrimination relate. But there wasn't a study to discuss the relationship between poverty and racial inequality.
And as I have read, O'Connell also expands on alternative ideas of how racial threat, demographic and economic conditions, and wealth distribution historically shape the environment, and her own expectations as to how these affect the relationship between poverty and racial inequality. Tell me again, what did her study find?
Well, as expected, analyzing the data sets between 1860 and 2000 of the U.S. Census, her study found the high poverty rates for Black people can be traceable to the counties that slavery was highly persisted in, and were lower within the legacy of slavery where it was less common so, though the severity of poverty varies between each county. Since independent models were used in the study, slavery could also be correlated to the overall uneasy economic opportunities that Black people face today.
And what I find even more interesting is that O'Connell's possible articulations on other or further forms of the study of legacy with how current populations between white and black racial groups could stem from the exploitation of slavery's post-economy and how these shape political and social institutions today. This study is great because it offers how the narratives of slavery can still ring true and affect Black people's chances to find true freedom and liberation, as those born into poverty-stricken areas of the rural South are subjected to environmental factors that were shaped during the time of slavery.
Precisely. And I imagine in the context of Copper Sun, how Amari's spirit and her family's legacy live on, and how their family tree and their early institutions of slavery are not even more are now even more tortured because of the world they were born into without a choice.
Yeah. Similar to the film where Dr. Veronica attempts to find freedom through the liberation of the empowerment of Black women, only to be kidnapped unknowingly by those who wish to see Black people further oppressed in modern age and deprive them of any freedoms, especially with that of the economic aspect taking place in Louisiana. The Lewis Hamilton image can be analyzed for the most important connection of Black people's contemporary imaging of how freedom is not easily obtainable, as the social circumstances for communities in 1863 are similar to those of the present. Only the methods have changed, but the underlying discrimination is still present.
What a great analogy, and how the study's analysis of the 1860 and 2000 communities link without the Lewis Hamilton image between the abuse of Black people from 1863 to 2020. Even now, it's shocking to find how slavery's legacy has shaped the lives of many of those today.
Oh, it gets worse when you read the article by Pager and Shepard on the sociological overview of racial discrimination in economic and social institutions. So Devin Pager, who was a sociology and public professor, and Hannah Shepard, who works at Princeton University as an assistant professor, investigated how racial discrimination still persists today. Both professors present ways to possibly measure discrimination through primary sources, which can be from self-reported discrimination, statistical and experimental data, as well as legal definitions and how they've been historically used in cases. Though they do note that based on literature review of other sociological studies, other independent variables account for natural rise in social and economic disparities during recent times. It's important to study discrimination for when it happens.
That's right, and especially for this conversation, it's pertinent. The study then continues, and what they find is disappointing to say the least. In the areas of potential employment, house finding and finances, credit markets, and consumer markets, various forms of racial discrimination could still be found. These types of discriminations would also, or would often disallow for the equal opportunity for Black people to be employed by their white counterparts, not being able to be or get adequate information, or would be tied to unfair contracts on loans, agreements, or product purchasing, and could be discriminated against where racial segregation has historically taken place. The most terrible piece of information to me was the statistics that highlighted discrimination against Black women, where on average in jobs, they would be paid 6% less than their white female counterparts, and would be discriminated against if they were perceived to, quote, speak in a manner associated with a lower class upbringing, unquote, than those who were brought up in the middle class. For both professors, they offered why such discrimination still persists today, which they attribute to possible prejudice, stereotyping, or historic beliefs against Black people. Other possible reasons could include structural factors that originated during Jim Crow, where policies and laws remained in historical and legal institutions, increasing the chances for racial and class discrimination and disenfranchisement of Black people today.
And that really resonates with our slave narratives that involve Black female protagonists, especially with Dr. Veronica in her fight against the angry Black woman stereotyping, where she attempts to break that kind of gender and racial barrier that has attached itself to historic discrimination. We could even make a case for Amari with the study in Copper Sun with how racial discrimination affected a large amount of early African American females because of hurtful and wrong stereotypes and prejudice based on their origins from Africa.
And going as far as to note, we should also include how women were treated in the times of slavery, as it's also pertinent to our conversation. As gender roles for girls like Amari and Polly were seen by their male counterparts as inferior, especially in Amari's case, where she was abused physically, sexually, and emotionally.
And with that, Paget and Shepard's overview also speaks to the findings made by O'Connell and further expands on her points of social and economic discrimination that have taken place in the aftermath of slavery and how the legacy of slavery still remains in today's society, where Black people are negatively affected economically by the social structures and environmental factors that surround them. These racial and social perceptions likewise stigmatize how Black people are treated publicly, which we can see in the Lewis Hamilton image, where police brutality targeting Black people unfairly is similar because of a possible speaking mannerism, or areas where they are brought up heavily resides concentrations of Black communities from Jim Crow segregation and housing ordinances.
And this kind of reminds me of my own city in St. Petersburg, Florida, where infamous cases of racial discrimination created divisions among communities of white and Black. These were originated during Jim Crow, where public highways and housing ordinations have economically pushed Black people south and westward away from the city center. The best example of this being the construction of a baseball stadium that was originally known as the Florida Suncoast Dome. It was home originally to a prominent Black community, which was called the Gas Plant District, and was bought out by the city or taken by eminent domain in hopes of economic return for the city, which never actualized. What's even crazier is that at the time of construction and planning, in 10 years after that, they didn't even have a Major League Baseball team for the stadium, as it was not a guarantee. So this city could have lost largely a historic, social, and cultural presence of a prominent African American community.
And I think that brings us to our final point about this whole conversation. How do these contemporary narratives and mediums imagine racial tensions and the ideas of a liberating future? So, well, as we've seen, racial tensions from the legacy of slavery are far from being healed, and the ideas of liberation are equally far from being obtainable. Contemporary narratives continue to bring light to the truth of history repeating itself with doubt of a liberating future, without recognizing and lending open ears for yearning hearts of Black people. They will continue to fall victim to this cycle of institutionalized slavery, and they will get tired. They are exhausted, actually. Nonetheless, their physical lives may remain vulnerable to a system of oppression, but their minds can never be forced into captivity, as it's something no one can take away from them.
And that's what keeps the persecutors up at night. Well put.
Thank you. And on that note, we have reached the ending of our discussion.
And I've been your host, Alex.
And I have been your co-host, Alice.
And this serves as the conclusion of this podcast episode of ANAs.
It ain't over.